here and talk. It's very exciting for me because I don't get to talk about sports nutrition that much anymore. So this is quite an exciting opportunity for me. The presentation is more for my benefit, just to make sure that I keep on track and we don't go too off track, and I cover everything that we need to cover. So if there are any questions during, that's absolutely fine. Just get involved. We'll make it a discussion. And I've left plenty of time at the end just to make sure that we do have a good, interesting discussion. I've noticed that when you have sports nutrition talks, there's a lot of people who have burning personal questions about things that they know and want to know. So I've tried to cover the basics of sports nutrition here, especially for endurance athletes and running such as yourselves. But yeah, feel free to get involved. Any questions that you've got, and there'll be plenty of time at the end to discuss as well. So, as I said, we'll be covering the basics. So we'll be covering carbohydrates, protein, fats, a little bit on hydration, basics of recovery, some very basic practical nutrition points. I've noticed that people who do sports nutrition and also people that do sports tend to have a good idea about nutrition anyway. This is kind of more from a student perspective when you're trying to make them actually cook and eat real food. But we'll go over just some very, very, very quick basics of practical nutrition points and then supplements as well. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about me, as self-centered as that is, just to make sure that you do believe the words that I say. So, undergrad, I did Sheffield Hallam University. You might be able to tell that I'm a northerner. So I did my undergrad in physical activity, health and exercise science. I went on to Loughborough to do an MSc in sport and exercise nutrition, because that was what I was interested in at the time. But after that, I actually moved away and did my PhD here in Oxford, in Oxford Brookes, looking at fats and lipids and appetite regulation. So like I said, this is a slightly different topic to what I usually talk about at the moment. And at the moment, I've now finished my PhD, and I'm a postdoc researcher at King's College London, and I'm looking at different fats and cardiometabolic health. And as you can see, I am not a runner, I'm actually a powerlifter, so this is none of this I can actually apply to myself, but trust me, this is more or less correct what we're going to talk about. So the hierarchy of nutrition. For different people, different populations, different athletes and that sort of thing, the hierarchy of nutrition kind of stays roughly the same. So the important parts of nutrition are basically the same for all populations. Energy balance is the most important thing. So by energy balance, I mean the food that you have coming in and the energy that you are expending. It's basic laws of physics, basic thermodynamics. So if you consume more energy than you're expending, you're going to gain weight. If you expend more energy than you're intaking, you're going to lose weight, very basic principles. And they're the same for all populations. So people that say, I don't eat that much but I can't lose weight, you're incorrect. I'm afraid you either are eating more or doing less than you think. So the energy balance point is always the same. Now for runners, is this purely Kidlington Running Club? Is everybody runners here? Okay, fine. That's good. So for runners and endurance athletes, it's slightly less important because it's what you could call training weight. Because if you put on a bit more extra weight, training is going to be harder, and so your adaptation to training might be a little bit better. So it's slightly less important. But if you start guzzling loads of energy drinks, start having it as takeaways to try and refuel, as we all try and justify to ourselves after a particularly hard session, you are going to eventually put on weight if you make that a consistent thing. So moving up the hierarchy, macronutrients. So these are carbohydrate, fat and protein, that's all that means. These are the big nutrients in our diet. And these are very important as well because you need to make sure that you're fueling with the correct thing, essentially. If you're having too much fat, your training might suffer and your performance might suffer. So again, macronutrients, one up from there. We then move on to nutrient timing. Now there seems to be a lot of debate about this, and I'm not entirely sure why. When I say debate, I don't mean in like the academic community, I mean in the sports nutrition community, because some people think that nutrient timing doesn't matter as much. And I disagree on the basis that if you are training particularly hard, if you're training multiple times a day or every single day, how you recover from one session might impact your next session. So if you don't recover enough, your next session will suffer, and then if you don't recover from that, your next session will suffer, so on and so forth. And eventually you'll either not be able to train, and you'll get miserable, or you might even get ill because you're not recovering properly. So nutrient timing is important as well. Micronutrients, so these are your vitamins, your minerals, and fibre, and that sort of thing. These are more important, not necessarily from a sports perspective, but more from a health perspective. We all know that you need to get your vitamins, you need to get your 5 a day, or now it's 30 a week, which is, I think, better, because it's easier to make sure you have 20 portions of those when you have a roast at the weekend, and then you don't eat so much of it in a week. But micronutrients are important just for general health. And as much as we want to talk about timing and carbohydrates and all this sort of stuff for a sports performance perspective, if you can't train because you're ill, obviously that's going to have an impact as well. And finally, I couldn't fit it in, but that S is for supplements. So people typically want to know what supplements work, what supplements are best for a sports performance, what supplement's going to give you that little edge. And unfortunately, it's just a little bit at the top. It's going to give you those tiny little percentages that may or may not increase performance. And so, yes, it's on the hierarchy, but it's probably the least important. If this isn't sorted, and the micronutrients aren't sorted, and your health isn't sorted, this isn't going to sort it. So carbohydrates, super important for endurance athletes. As I'm sure a lot of people here know, we are going to cover the basics of carbohydrates. So why are carbohydrates important? I'm sorry that this is going to be, generally speaking, a relatively academic-looking presentation, but don't worry, we'll go through it in a non-academic way. But these are basically, this graph here on the left is basically the principle of why carbohydrates are important. What you have here is how hard somebody's working, so this is 100% of effort, so if you're running flat out towards either the finish line or the bus. And what you have here is how much fat you use and how much carbohydrate you use. And basically, if you look here, as you work harder and harder and harder, carbohydrate use increases. So basically, when you are running and assuming you're racing, you're going to be working relatively hard, at least at some point in that race. If you're not, you need to be in a different race because you're clearly killing it. But if you are running harder and harder and harder, you're going to be using carbohydrates. So logically speaking, you need to consume carbohydrates to fuel that performance. And this is basically from the same paper, or from a similar paper, sorry. And it's basically showing that the harder that you work, so this is 85%, this is muscle glycogen, and plasma glucose down here, you're basically just using a lot of carbohydrate as a fuel source. So carbohydrate is absolutely critical for endurance performance. Daily targets. Okay, so daily targets. What we have here is how much carbohydrate somebody should be consuming, for their task. So light training load. So that would be if you are possibly rehabbing, prehabbing, if you're not doing anything that requires too much energy output. So if you're not going for a run, you're having a low intensity or skill-based session. Moderate would be, you're cruising. Maybe you've done a race and you need a bit of time off, you need to take it easy for a couple of weeks, that might be your moderate. High endurance, high training load would be endurance hours 1 to 3 days a week, 1 to 3 hours a day, sorry. So that would be, when you're serious, you're healthy, you're prepping for a race. And then very high, I'm not making any assumptions here, but that's probably more geared towards professional athletes. Multiple hours, multiple sessions every single day. So the average person and the people that are training not too hard, 3 to 5 grams of carbohydrate per kilo of body weight. So, if you're like me, and I realise I'm probably slightly heavier than the usual runner, but if you're 100 kilos, I'm only using that just because it's a nice round number, you're going to be looking at 3 to 5 grams 3 to 500 grams of carbohydrate per day if you're training in a light session. Moderate, you want to be looking at around the 5 to 7 gram mark. 7 to 10 grams if you're per kilo of body weight if you're training at high intensities multiple times a week. And then for the ultra athletes among you, 10 to 12 grams of carbohydrate per week. I'm going to caveat that by saying that is a lot of carbohydrate, and consuming that much is incredibly hard. Very high will basically only pertain to the actual professional athletes among you, if there are any. And for those that are doing at least marathons, if not more, ultra marathons, cycling many, many miles a week. So they're your basic carbohydrate needs. In terms of carbohydrate content of common foods, pastas, as you probably imagine, typical running and typical endurance sports food. Pasta, you're looking at about 30 grams of carbohydrate per 100 grams of potato, which is why I think it's amazing that people think that pasta and rice is really healthy, but potato isn't, when it's got almost double the amount of carbohydrate content. And I also love potatoes, I don't know how you could cut that out of your diet. In terms of carbohydrate ingestion during exercise, so this can be for training, this can be if you are racing, if you're doing 5k, 10k, marathon, that sort of thing. Unfortunately, I say unfortunately because I personally love carbohydrates and I love sports drinks, but if you're training for less than 60 minutes, you don't have to have any. It's not going to benefit your performance in any way. You have enough carbohydrates stored within your body, in your liver, as hepatic glycogen, in the muscles, in the blood, that it's really not going to improve your performance or improve any training sessions if it's for less than 60 minutes. You're not going to use the stores that you already have. If you're going above the 60-minute mark, however, so if you're above 1 hour of training, so 1 hour to an hour and a half, somewhere around 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour will possibly give you a performance benefit. Because around the 60 to 90-minute mark, that's when stores start to run low. And that's when, typically speaking, people start to need that bit of extra help. So having something like a sports drink at this point, or at least if you know you're going to be training for this one, can be important. And if you're doing marathons, 10Ks, or anything like that, something of a slightly longer total period, so 90 minutes plus, I'm going to go ahead and assume that nobody can do a marathon in 90 minutes. So anything for longer than that time, up to 90 grams per hour is achievable, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So 90 grams per carbohydrate per hour is a vast amount of carbohydrates to consume, so it does need a lot of thought. You can't just go in there going, I'm going to have this much food. You're going to have to forgive, I think it's this one, you're going to have to forgive me. One of these slides is incredibly technical, and only on the way here did I think I probably should have not put this in because it's entirely unnecessary, but bear with me and we'll make it work. So the human gut can only absorb 60 grams of glucose per hour. It is this slide, yeah. So the reason that is, sodium-dependent glucose transporter 1 is basically the thing that takes it from the gut into the blood, into the muscles, and it basically takes it around the body. And it has an upper limit of 60 grams per hour, and that's of glucose specifically. So there are different types of sugar, different types of carbohydrate. Glucose is one of them, probably the most common. Different types of carbohydrates are absorbed differently. So glucose is one, fructose is another, which is transported by GLUT5, which is basically a different transporter. One of them's taking a bike, one of them's in the Uber. They're just getting there via a different mechanism. On the basis that they have different routes of transport, different transporters taking them around the body, extra can be consumed. So if you want to consume over 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour, you can have glucose and fructose in a 2-to-1 ratio. So 60 grams of glucose, 30 grams of fructose.
Are there any other types of sugar you can take in that would be transported by a different thing?
You could have sucrose as well, but glucose and fructose are the ones that we can definitively say have a synergistic effect, and the ones that we know that can be tolerated. The problem with some of the studies that have tried to experiment with sucrose is it basically makes people quite ill to have them, because people won't have sucrose in that high doses, and so basically there are some adverse effects that are achieved with that. And that actually leads me perfectly onto my next one, my disclaimer. That is very much like a physiological basis of what can be done. Please don't tomorrow go and have 90 grams of sugar in one go. Purely on the basis that the likelihood is that is a vast amount of carbohydrate and a vast amount of sugar to have in one go, it's very likely that you might feel a bit ill. As we train the respiratory system, we train our muscles in order to improve. You can train the gut in a sense, and you can train yourself to consume more and more of the sugar. So if anyone is aware of how much they consume at the minute, add a little bit more. If not, start experimenting with how much sugar, how much carbohydrate and glucose and fructose that you can tolerate, and then slowly add a bit more in. Yes?
I read somewhere that, I read somewhere that glucose is much easily broken down and transported in the body than fructose, which is apparently digested in the liver. Is that right?
Okay.
Metabolized in the liver, whereas glucose can be directly diffused in the bloodstream. I've also been told through the poor research I've done that fructose is actually quite a poor sugar to take because of the way that it's metabolized.
Okay, so that's not entirely wrong or not entirely right. There's some stuff there that some stuff there that is correct. So yes, we can only absorb through 30 grams per hour of fructose. So that in itself means that on the basis that you can have 60 grams of glucose, it is better tolerated. Glucose and fructose are all metabolized and all get transported by the blood, so it all ends up in the blood. And then to an extent, depending on the activity that you're doing, some of it will be broken down into by the liver. So if you're training at high intensities and you're training for a long period of time, you'll deplete the glucose in your blood, you'll start to deplete the glucose in your muscles, and eventually the glucose in your liver as well. And so yes, it will be metabolized in the liver to an extent, because you need to maintain that liver, the amount of carbohydrate in your liver, because if that starts to drop, that's when the brain starts panicking and you can start having loads of other physiological effects like producing ketones and that sort of thing. So it's not entirely incorrect. Yes, glucose is metabolized better, so that's why glucose is the one that we say, okay, have this, and then if you're trying to get that bit more, you can supplement with fructose. I would never say have fructose first for those exact reasons, but there's nothing wrong with having the fructose if you're supplementing on top of the glucose that you're already having. So it is kind of correct, like yes, I would definitely say glucose is metabolized more easily and there's less chance of you having any adverse effect in terms of GI distress, so like cramping and that sort of thing. But I'd say there's nothing wrong with slowly adding more in, if that makes sense. So carbohydrates and immune function. So this is quite an old paper, but not much has changed in terms of carbohydrates and immune function. And I apologise, I'm very much used to putting up this sort of thing, so I realise that the people that I like, the academics that my colleagues that I talk to, I put this up and they're like, oh, read that. I realise that most people aren't going to do that because they're not nerds like we are. But I'd just like to highlight, that's actually a lot darker than I thought it was going to be, but I'd just like to highlight this point here. The most impressive results have been reported with carbohydrate supplementation in terms of immune function. Carbohydrate beverage ingestion has been associated, I'm not going to go through all these, but basically all of these things, attenuated cortisol, increased plasma glucose, better whole growth hormone response, fewer perturbations in blood immune cell counts, etc., etc., etc. Carbohydrates basically, to put that into layman's terms, feed the immune system. All of the cells that work in the immune system, so the monocytes, the phagocytes, granulocytes as well, all feed off carbohydrates. So if you're training quite hard and you are basically putting yourself in a compromised immune state because you're putting stress upon your body and you have to recover from that stress, carbohydrate is essentially necessary in order to ensure proper immune function, which is partially why I'll never understand how people don't have carbohydrates on the basis that A, they're delicious, B, they help you train, but they also make sure that you stay healthy and that you can continue training. Has anyone heard of the concept train low, compete high? Got a couple of people nodding, perfect. So this is basically the idea that if you train in a low glycogen state, so basically you don't have much glucose, you don't have much glycogen in your body, so you've restricted carbohydrates, and then you then train, you have a greater adaptation to the training. It's essentially the point of training low and being high. And that's because training adaptations occur as part of a response to stress. You put your body under stress, you recover from that stress, and then you're better able to do that, deal with that stress again. There is a greater stress in a low glycogen state on the basis that you don't have the fuel in order to perform, to do the exercise, to do any activity that you're doing. Again, sorry, unnecessarily overcomplicated, but basically all of these things here, so transcriptional activation of enzymes involved in carbohydrate metabolism, all of these points here are the cellular adaptations that happen in response to training. So the theory is greater stress in the low glycogen state, the greater stress, the greater the adaptation. And there is a lot of evidence to suggest that that is the case. If you perform in, let's say you're doing it first thing in the morning and you're fasted, your stress is greater to that singular session. The only problem with that is that performance is generally affected by training in a low carbohydrate state. So if you wake up in the morning and you go training, on the basis that you don't have the glycogen to fuel the performance won't be as good as it could be. So, sorry, my fitness going off, telling me I've just done 10,000 steps, or just now. I can't remember what I was saying, cheers for that. So if you, trying to retrace my train of thought now.
Train fasted,
Train faster, thank you. So if you train faster, you wake up in the morning, you go, your performance will be decreased. So your 10K time might be a lot slower than usual. If you can hack that mentally, and you can keep going with that, and you incorporate train low, compete high, or train low, compete high sessions in your normal training, there is a possibility that your overall performance will be increased, because you'll have the performance from when you've trained in a fed state and the performance when you've trained in a fasted state. And the theory is that if you combine them together, that might have a beneficial overall effect. There are other techniques that you can use to minimize this reduction in performance. So you can have a carbohydrate mouth rinse, which we know is linked to psychological senses in the brain. So we know that you will basically feel better. Caffeine, obviously. Protein intake is, I think, necessary, because I think fasting and training is one way to make sure that you basically break down muscle tissue. So we want to avoid that if we can. And like I've alluded to already, mixing low and high sessions in order to make sure that your timings of performance are the same, but you also get the benefit from train low and compete high. So, ketogenic diets. Before I go any further, is anybody following a ketogenic diet? Excellent. I've got nothing against ketogenic diets, but I tend to find that people that do are very militant about it. So it's going to be a very controversial slide if I've done it.
You say never that militant I used to, but I would say that my carbohydrates are anyway near the level that you suggested.
Okay.
I have a lot more than you used to.
Yeah. Okay. We'll work with that. That's fine. So the theory is, and again, I'd like to disclaimer, this is purely for sports performance and for exercise performance. If we're talking from a medical perspective, so people with epilepsy, people who are developing Alzheimer's and certain other conditions where the condition essentially feeds upon carbohydrate in the brain, that's an entirely different story. This is purely for people doing it either for weight loss or specifically for sport performance. So the reason why ketogenic diets did get quite popular quite a few years ago in terms of endurance sport and endurance performances, the theory is using fat as a main fuel source will spare carbohydrate use for later or higher efforts. So if we quickly think back to that first slide I showed you, as you work harder and as you work longer, carbohydrate use in the body increases. So the theory is if you can basically save or shift that so that you're saving carbohydrates for the latter part of a race, the idea is that your performance will be maintained at a higher rate for longer. Unfortunately, this is suboptimal for performance in terms of endurance, from an endurance standpoint, because consistently we show that carbohydrate supplementation, carbohydrate diets, and higher carbohydrate intakes basically correlate with high performance due to the fact that it's a preferable fuel source. The caveat of that is, are you training for fun or are you training for high level performance? If you're someone who is just running for the crack, you enjoy running, it's just something to stay healthy, and ketogenic diet suits your lifestyle, I'm not going to be here to tell you to do otherwise. If you like doing it and it works for you, that's absolutely fine. I can guarantee that Eliud did not have a ketogenic diet when he ran the 2-hour marathon, and I severely doubt there are any other, when I say severely doubt, I'm almost entirely certain, that there are no other high-level endurance athletes, at least, that engage in a ketogenic diet. And then there's the other option, the other caveat of the health aspect. Typically speaking, ketogenic diets tend to be high in saturated fat, and that's only because, sorry, I should probably go back. If for anyone who doesn't know, ketogenic diet is where you have a very low amount of carbohydrates and you have a high amount of fat. And by having a high amount of fat, you produce ketones in the liver, which are an alternative fuel source instead of glucose. The problem with that is, typically speaking, if you're on a ketogenic diet, you do tend to consume a lot of saturated fat. Now, as much as Tim Noakes, who's a professor in South Africa, who was promoting this not long ago, as much as he would like to say that's absolutely fine, I'd like to think that correlates with the fact that he released a book on the topic as well. Read into that what you will. But we essentially know quite consistently that saturated fat does have negative health connotations. And so, yeah, training for fun, but there's also this to consider as well. So to summarise carbohydrates, carbohydrates are needed to optimise athletic performance. And the co-ingestion of glucose and fructose can maximise carbohydrate absorption. How much you have depends on what you're doing, so essentially more on heavier days. And adequate carbohydrate intake can support a healthy immune function. So moving on to protein, the second of the macronutrients. You think that protein is something that you speak more to someone like me who enjoys lifting things at a rate of 1 lift every 20 minutes, because I'm not very fit. But protein is also important for general population and for endurance athletes as well. Why do we need protein? Well, we all know, this is very basic stuff, but we all know that protein builds and repairs muscle tissue, but it also helps in hormone regulation and production. It can be useful in appetite control on the basis that protein is the most filling of the 3 macronutrients, and protein helps with fluid balance as well. So the general recommendations for general population are about 0.8 grams per kilo per day. I disagree with that, but that is a different topic for another time. We don't have time to go into those. But for sports-based recommendations, for recreational athletes, 1 kilo a day, 1 gram per kilo a day, you struggle getting a kilo of protein in a day, I've tried. 1 gram per kilo per day is about what you would expect for a recreational athlete. That slightly higher amount should be enough to repair any damage that you're doing. For endurance athletes, that might be a little bit higher, purely because the damage that an endurance athlete imparts on their body is a little higher than the recreational athletes. And the ultra endurance athlete can be anywhere between 1.2 to 2 grams per kilo per day. And as a bit of a comparison, a strength athlete would be looking at around 1.5 all the way up to 2.2 grams per day. The problem with protein synthesis, which is basically how well we use the protein to repair and build new muscle, is limited per meal. So if you have 100 grams of protein in the evening, a lot of that, so what we have here is 40 grams, a lot over this threshold won't actually be used to build new muscle. You can only, or you can optimally utilize protein when it's somewhere around 20-25 grams in a single meal. I don't know if anyone's on Instagram and Twitter, that sort of thing. I've put a couple of these up at the end, a couple of accounts to follow at the end, which are really good. But this is Jan Lemieux, I've probably said it correctly, Jan Lemieux Sports Science. And he just has these really, really good infographics which really simplify some of the findings on a vast array of topics. And I know that's quite hard to read. I do have a slide with it printed a bit better at the end.
I'm just blind.
It wasn't just you, everyone just kind of going, that's terrible. But basically what we have here is this was a study that was examining the breakdown of protein across the course of a day, or across the course of several days. And as you can see here, most people, and this is the same for athletes and most recreational, populations as well, most people consume a vast amount of protein in an evening meal. So this is around the 40 gram mark, which, as I've already mentioned, is suboptimal for protein metabolism. But as you see here, some people are having up to 60 grams in one day, in one meal. So if you're aiming for 90 grams in a day, let's say, based on your weight and based on the recommendations, if you're having 60 of it in one meal, you're almost wasting half of it. So what you should be aiming to do is break this up throughout the day. Make sure you have an adequate amount of protein at breakfast, make sure you have an adequate amount of protein at lunch, and then the same in the evening. Try and break it up, don't just have it all in one go.
You might come on to this later, but I guess, well, I don't know. I think I know what the impact of carbohydrates is, in terms of being able to identify yourself. You feel exhausted, you can't run any further, that you make you actually. Is what's the kind of impact of protein? How do you know?
It's a really good question. It's a really good question. There would be no, off the top of my head, there would be no way of easily at home measuring if you're having enough protein. And actually, this even in labs is quite a hard thing to measure. And the reason why protein recommendations are, I think, a bit outdated is purely on the basis that there's continually ongoing debate on how we measure how much someone needs. So there's a measure of nitrogen excretion that some labs use, and then there's labs looking at protein building based on all of the stimuli that you give a muscle. So it's a good question. It's really hard to answer on the basis that there's no definitive way.
It must differ slightly from individual to individual as well.
So it's funny that you say that, because the original paper showing this was in a group of males that were about 75 kilos, And so the argument is, okay, well, if those were way heavier and they had more muscle, would these values be increased? And those studies have been done, and it seems to be very consistent across populations and across sizes. So people who were 75 kilos, people who were 90 kilos plus, and people who had larger amounts of lean mass, so muscle mass, these numbers are quite consistent. The only thing that we do know is that if you engage more of the muscles, so for example, if you just use your legs, for example, cycling, versus if you do a whole body workout, how much protein you absorb and how much you metabolize is increased. But generally speaking, this is quite consistent in healthy populations.
What's limiting the 20 grams?
Sorry, say that again.
So you say about 20 grams of protein per meal. Is it you just can't digest it, or?
It's not so much the digestion. So it's still digested. Any excess doesn't just sit there. It essentially gets broken down into glucose. It just isn't used for protein synthesis. So it isn't used for making new muscle and repairing muscle. It comes down to the pathways involved in protein synthesis. So there's something called mTOR, which is one of the pathways that's activated by one of the protein amino acids. And it's thought that there's only so much that it can do. So in the same way that glucose can only be transported up to 60 grams, around 20 to 25 grams will maximally stimulate those pathways, and that's what's thought. We don't know exactly, and I mentioned talk last week about protein, and he says that they're looking at that. So hopefully there'll be something soon. But that is continually ongoing debate as to why we can only absorb so much and utilise so much for protein synthesis. So in order to maximise protein synthesis, this is a study done by Trainload over in the Netherlands. And what we have here, I probably should have put some legends on this, but what we have here are 3 equal protein servings, like I alluded to. If you have 30 grams, the green is protein synthesis. This is where you've had a decent amount of protein, your muscles are using it, they're absorbing it, they're building, that's great. In between the meals, obviously, you're not eating, so you slowly go into protein breakdown. And then again, you stimulate by more protein synthesis, more protein. And essentially what you want here is you want these peaks to be higher than these troughs, and you will be building good muscle. This here is those many hours, or few hours, depending on how well you sleep, that you are not eating and you are asleep. And this is over in Luke van Loon's lab and Trainload's lab. Is basically, if you have all of these peaks through the breakfast, lunch and dinner where you have adequate protein intake, if you then, if you have some pre-sleep protein, which could be as easy as milk, it could be, I'm probably going to say cheese, because I know eating cheese before bed can induce nightmares, but if you have some milk or anything with a decent amount of protein in, you increase how much protein synthesis you have, and you decrease the breakdown. So there are methods to maximise that protein synthesis. Protein content of common foods. So again, trying to make this slightly more practical. Grilled chicken breast, around 32 grams of protein in 100 grams. So 100 grams of chicken breast in each meal. Maybe not breakfast, but you see the point. 100 grams of chicken breast, and you've hit the protein recommendation there. Same with beef, similar with tuna, although you do need a little bit more. And we'll take it down here. Almonds, surprisingly, really high amounts of protein content. I'm going to caveat that by saying that we'll also have a lot of fat as well. So do be careful when you're choosing your protein sources. Chicken, quite a low amount of fat in chicken breast that's grilled. Beef steak, even if it's lean, does have more. So typically speaking, if you're having meat sources for your protein, you do have to be wary of the fat content as well. So in summary, 2 grams of kilo per body weight will max out beneficial responses. Now that is mainly aimed at strength athletes. If you're an ultra endurance athlete, that will also max out the responses to protein as well. My caveat of that is be wary of over-consuming protein at the detriment of carbohydrate. Carbohydrate will be the most important thing that you can consume, so just make sure that you are breaking protein up throughout the day and that you're having enough, and then that should be okay. 30 grams, I've put 30 grams here, that's just to make sure that you hit that that maximal muscle protein synthesis. But that should be enough to maximise the adaptive response. And every meal should contain ample protein. So if you're having a meal that is considerably low protein, and when I say meal, I do mean an actual meal where you sit down and have it, not like a post-training drink, that's absolutely fine. Make sure that you're getting carbohydrate there. But every proper meal should contain ample amounts of protein. So, fat. Fat is an interesting topic. Fat is an interesting topic because quite recently there seems to be a lot of debate as to what constitutes healthy fat, and so nobody trusts nutritionists because nobody can agree. But fat is quite an interesting topic. So why fat? Well, fat is a source of energy at low intensities and in the absence of carbohydrate, as we discussed already. Fat is also essential for vitamin absorption. So there are water-soluble vitamins like vitamin C, which if you have too much of, you will just waste down the toilet. But there are fat-soluble vitamins, so A, D, E, and K, which are needed, in which fat is needed to absorb. Fat is also needed for insulation and protection. So if you're a powerlifter like me, you have lots of insulation and you're well protected, which is what I tell people. No, I'm just protected, it's fine. And they're also a source of essential fatty acids. There are fatty acids that you make in the body, and there are those that you don't make, such as the omega-3 fatty acids, and you need to acquire them through the diet. So the main types of fat. So in butter, what would be the main type of fat in butter? Saturated fat, yes. We have sunflower oil and we have olive oil. Either will do, shout out.
Unsaturated, polyunsaturated.
Poly and, what's the other one? Poly and mono, yeah. Poly and monounsaturated fat. This is a bit of a trick one because everyone knows about these, but they're kind of not so much in the diet anymore. In biscuits and cakes and stuff that's been manufactured, what's the fat that you should avoid at all costs?
Trans fat.
Trans fat, fantastic. Trans fats are now slowly being phased out of the manufacturing process, and actually the postdoc that I'm doing now is examining some of the fats that have replaced them. But those are the fats that you will typically have in the diet. We want to minimise how much saturated fat that we consume because we know that this is linked with cardiovascular disease and coronary heart disease and stuff like that, and high cholesterol. And we want to maximise the poly and the monounsaturated fats, and we want to avoid trans fats at all costs because we do know that trans fats are heavily linked with cardiovascular disease. So again, the fat content of common foods, that shouldn't be too surprising because it's a bottle of oil, but 100 grams of oil contains 100 grams of fat. Butter around 82 grams. Chicken breast, like we said before, very, very low fat, so if you're looking for lean protein sources, chicken breast is a good source. Turkey's even better. Beef mince, now this varies because obviously you can get various amounts of beef mince, how well they've actually minced it, the percentage of fat that they put in there, is it actually including other things like pork, because I've been caught off of that before. And you can also get lower varieties where it's now minced with vegetables, which are quite good for lowering the fat content. Salmon, decent amount of fat in there, and that's going to be the omega-3s that the essential fatty acids, the omega-3s that you can't make in the body. And so, as much as we say, try and limit how much fat you have from fish, you make sure that you're getting the amount, the 3 to 5 portions of oily fish a week. And then cheddar cheese, 33 grams. Nuts, on average, that varies massively from the different types of nuts, so be careful with what you're having there. And then whole eggs, around 11 grams of fat. I haven't talked too much about fat because on the basis that we need to focus on carbohydrates for endurance sports, and fat is mainly for more of a health perspective of endurance. So that was a very brief overview. I'm happy to talk a bit more about fat later if anybody's interested. But I thought we'd move on to hydration. So has anyone seen this before? The what is my hydration status? So this is basically a neat little tool on what you need to think of to see if you are hypohydrated, which is basically the correct term for dehydrated. Dehydration is a process by which you become hypohydrated. So, with that in mind, what 3 things would you look out for if you are thinking, am I dehydrated? Any ideas? Urine, that's one. W, any ideas what the W might be? Weight. And then T?
Thirst.
Thirst, there you go, perfect. The 3 things you can look out for are weight, urine, and thirst. If you weigh less after a session than what you did before, you're probably hyperhydrated because you've sweated and you've respired, and so you've lost fluid through those. If you are producing lots of urine, or if your urine is darker than typical, or if it's just typically darker, it's a chance are that you are hyperhydrated as well. And if you're thirsty, again, chances are you're hyperhydrated. I wouldn't use thirst by itself as a measure because it's quite delayed as a response. And so if you're thirsty now, you've been hyperhydrated for a while. And so it's not necessarily a good measure. But if you have more, if you have 2 of these, or if you have all 3, you are almost definitely hyperhydrated. Now, hyperhydration isn't necessarily a terrible thing. You're going to be dehydrated after a session because it's impossible to have as much fluid as you sweat. Essentially, I don't know how to slide. No. Studies examining people running in the Boston Marathon basically show that everybody ends with some level of hyperhydration, from somewhere between 2% and 58% hyperhydrated. So everybody loses sweat, that's entirely normal, and so being hyperhydrated to some extent is absolutely fine. And I'm sure you might have seen something like this before, but it's really easy. If the clearer your urine is, the more hydrated you are. If it's getting to the darker colours, so the 6, 7, and 8, probably need to start considering how to get some fluid on board. Now, hypernatremia, has anybody heard of hypernatremia? Runners tend to know a little bit more about this. But this is basically what happens when people drink too much. During marathons, there was a lot, when I was back at school, we got those information videos about drugs and drinking too much, and people that were dying taking drugs and thinking that they need to have too much fluid. So basically, hypernatremia is a decrease in the electrolyte balance. So basically, the salt in your blood is basically not as concentrated as it should be. So, here it is, that's what I was looking for earlier. Up to 50% of runners have some degree of hypernatremia. And that's on the basis that people are consuming fluid, but they're also sweating, and so they're losing salt through the sweat. In severe cases, it can be fatal. So this was, I actually had to go a lot further back in marathon news than I thought to find this. But runners have died, unfortunately, in marathons where they've been given possibly incorrect information, or they've misinterpreted the information, and so they've consumed as much fluid as they possibly can. They've then sweated a lot, and then they've suffered through hypernatremia. Water, now this is usually met with some form of controversy, but water might not be the best drink for long sessions or races. And that's purely because you're not replacing any of the electrolytes that you're consuming. Is that a question or?
No.
Oh, you look like you would, sorry. So water is basically nothing but the fluid. There's nothing in there to replace the electrolytes and the salts that you're losing. And so it might not be the best drink for longer sessions or races. No? Sorry. I keep thinking I was going to jump in. Okay. And that takes us on to the recovery. Has anyone heard of the 3 R's of recovery? Okay. So we have refuel, rebuild, and rehydrate. The 3 R's, the 3 bases that you need to cover after a session in order to make sure that you are recovering from that session. In terms of refueling, we've talked about this already, but this is basically carbohydrates. So carbohydrates needed to optimize the adaptation to the session, and it's needed to fuel subsequent training. If you only have 1 session a day, or 1 session every couple of days, how quickly you get carbohydrate on board is less important. However, if you train in the morning and you know you're going to train again that night, or if you're training in the evening and you are training the next morning, getting carbohydrate on board can be important to ensure that you're recovering properly for those next sessions. 1 to 1.5 grams of carbohydrate during the first 30 minutes can help refuel after that session. And this is where I talked about earlier, the timing is important. So as you can see here, this is a study examining people when they trained them for, I think, an hour, maybe half an hour, but they trained people after running, and they had the participants either drink immediately after or don't drink, and they waited essentially until they got home after the session. And these blue bars are how much glucose is in the muscle. So this was during the race, during the training, a few hours later, and then overall. And basically, as you can see here, there's more fuel in the muscle. That's essentially all that graph is saying. If you consume carbohydrates straight after the training session, you're going to fuel better for your future sessions and for the adaptations to that session. And the type is important. So again, if you're going to be training again in the near future, the next day or later that day, avoid high fibre or high fat foods, food or drink in the post-training period, because these slow absorption essentially, these slow digestion. And so it's basically just going to slow the rate of carbohydrate and glucose getting into the muscles. To rebuild, so this is talking more about protein as we've discussed briefly already. So muscles are damaged after exercise, and that's the same whether it's strength training, whether it's weightlifting or running. And so the degree of damage does depend on the type of the session. If you're going for a soft 30-minute run versus if you're running for time as fast as you can for 2 hours, the muscle damage is logically going to be greater after the harder session. Protein is essential for the muscles to adapt and for those necessary adaptations to occur. So again, 20 to 30 grams of protein can help with that recovery. Carbohydrates and protein in a 2-to-1 ratio, so for example 6 grams of carbohydrate and 30 grams of protein will maximise protein absorption, as we've discussed already. But this isn't immediately after, this is probably in, let's say, the first meal after training. So you finish training at 7, you have a sports drink, you then get home and you have your chicken and your vegetables and all that sort of thing. And consume immediately, this should be specifically carbohydrates, this isn't just for protein. So consume immediately at the cessation of training or exercise. So that refers specifically to carbohydrates. And then, as I've said already, later on make sure you're getting adequate protein. And rehydration. So again, spoke about hyperhydration and dehydration. This basically aims to replace sweat loss during the exercise. So you want to replace 150% of the fluid that you've lost. And that's basically because you are inevitably going to produce urine when you drink. So if you replace it exactly, you will still end up in a deficit of fluid on the basis that you will lose some through urine losses. And sweat weight is highly individualized, but again, it's affected by training intensity, duration, and temperature. So logically, you train in a hotter environment, you're going to sweat more. That's just logical. Hyperhydration can be calculated by how much weight lost is during a session. So if you lose a kilo in a session, you've lost a kilo of fluids. The problem is, it's not easy for people at home to measure how much electrolytes they've lost. And so if you aim to make sure you're having at least some electrolytes, some salt, some potassium and that sort of thing in your drinks after training, that will help to an extent. It's impossible to know at home exactly how much, but if you're at least considering that and you're making sure you're trying to replace those sweat losses, then you'll be in a good place. And like I said here, aim to consume 150% of weight loss. So a cheap and easy recovery drink. So this is Nature's recovery drink. This is, you can buy it in any shop. It's nice and easy to get, you don't need to do anything special with it. Any ideas?
Coconut. Oh.
No. Perfect. Comparable amounts of carbohydrate in milk to sports drinks that we drink. So around 5% carbohydrate in 100 grams, about 5% carbohydrate, and that alters on what type of milk you get, if it's skimmed, semi-skimmed or whole, or if you're really decadent and you just drink Jersey Gold top out of the bottle. I know powerlifters that do that, it's crazy. It's like watching them drink cream, it's awful. So 5% carbohydrate in milk, 6.4 in a Lucozade, 4.7 in a Powerade, it's about the same, but more importantly, it's way cheaper. So if you're not lactose intolerant, and I realise that's very insensitive if anybody is, because I'm just saying drink milk and these other ones aren't as good, but basically milk is the better option, if that's assuming you like milk. Chocolate milk.
Does it have to be cow's milk?
It doesn't have to be cow's milk, but bovine milk is better. So the research examining, there's none comes to mind looking at the different types of milk in terms of goat's milk or sheep's milk, that sort of thing. But the non-animal milks are typically not as good. They don't have as much electrolytes, they don't have as much carbohydrate, and so as much as they will to some extent aid recovery, it's not quite as good as cow's milk. Another thing about cow's milk is the way it's digested it's essentially digested slowly enough that you produce less urine on a milliliter for milliliter level compared to water. So if you have a litre of water, a litre of milk, you'll produce far more urine after the water, and therefore you'll end up in a greater deficit. And so milk can help with that based on the way that it interacts with hormones involved in urine production. Chocolate milk. Now this goes down a treat when I tell this to students, because they're all like, yeah, I can drink chocolate milk, amazing. Chocolate milk is even better because they've obviously added things to it, and so the carbohydrate content is a little bit higher. And then if you look here, 100 grams of chocolate milk, 3.2 grams of protein. You're not going to reach the maximal protein synthesis that we talked about earlier, but it is going to help with some level of protein, muscle protein synthesis as well. So chocolate milk, perfect, well, honestly perfect, a really good recovery drink. Somewhat, that will come back to haunt me if I say perfect. A really good recovery drink. I will personally, I realise, anecdotally it doesn't necessarily mean much, but I will happily consume a litre of chocolate milk after a training session. I don't need to consume a litre of chocolate milk, I've not trained that hard, but I've never trained that hard, but chocolate milk is a really good recovery option. Practical nutrition. Now, I realise I'll be teaching a lot of you just eggs here, but cooking in bulk saves time over the week and it will help maintain optimal nutrition. It is really hard to get something ideal nutrition-wise if you're buying it from a shop to eat immediately. It's possible, you either have to spend a lot or go to like a good well-stocked shop, like a big Tesco, that sort of thing. But if you're prepared in advance and you take those foods with you, that will really help your recovery and hopefully have a knock-on effect with training. And it's also very cheap as well. It's a lot cheaper to buy a 10-kilo bag of rice and make sure that you can just have something quick after training instead of buying food out. And again, never rely on food being provided for you, because this is very cynical and very distrusting of me, but you don't know what they've done with it, you don't know what they've cooked with it. Yeah, it might be chicken and rice, but maybe they deep fried the chicken, and that's not going to aid your recovery optimally. And then non-chilled foods available, keep them on you if you can. So if you drive to training, so if you're going somewhere, you go for a run and then you're going to get back in your car, keep those in the car at all times. Jaffa cakes, milk, if not long term obviously, but if you can stock up for the day and have milk in the car, or if not, sports drinks, that sort of thing, if you can keep them on you at all times, you're just going to be adding those tiny little blocks that will help you build and recover optimally. So I think finally, these are the final points that I've got, I think. Supplements. Everyone loves a supplement section. The 3 rules of Ron Moore. If a supplement is not banned, it's probably not effective. If it is effective, it's probably banned. There are some exceptions, obviously. But essentially, if something is going to have an ergogenic aid, it's going to help in performance significantly, chances are it's doing something that it shouldn't be doing. So I just like to use this on the basis that there are obviously exceptions to this rule, but it's just a nice way of thinking, well, I'll make sure that all my nutrition is covered, I'll make sure that I'm getting all of the vitamins and minerals, and all of the macronutrients that I need, and I'm fluid, I'm hydrated properly. If you cover all of those bases, you don't need to consider nutrition. To consider supplements, sorry. These are some commonly questioned supplements. So we have creatine, whey protein, caffeine, bicarbonate, beta-alanine, multivitamins, carbohydrate. I don't know why I put that under a supplement because it's a macronutrient, but yeah, vitamin D and omega-3. Creatine more for strength sports and anaerobic sports like sprinting. Whey protein can be used by all populations, so if you struggle to get protein in, at least at first, it might be something worth considering, whey protein, and if not, again, milk. I love milk, as you can tell. Caffeine, we know that caffeine has an ergogenic effect. It increases motivation to train, and it can help with power output and lots of other things, so caffeine can help. Possibly not if you struggle sleeping, logically, maybe have less caffeine. And if you're training in the evening, again, maybe you don't have vast amounts of caffeine. And loads of my friends take little pre-workouts at like 8 o'clock at night, and then they wonder why they're awake at 4 AM. So bicarbonate of soda. Has anyone heard about this for a running and endurance? So to summarise bicarbonate, essentially all it's supposed to do is it's supposed to buffer the muscles, and it's supposed to help with your ability to withstand lactate. So it means that hypothetically, you can train and compete at higher levels. The problem with bicarbonate is like it says here, support for specific situations. The research is kind of 50-50. There's lots of studies showing an effect, lots of studies not showing an effect, and there are even more studies than not showing the fact that people can't tolerate bicarbonate of soda, so they'll have a scoop of it and then they get severe gastric distress. And so in my personal opinion, I don't think it's worth trying. It might be something that if you're really interested, you want to experiment with, but I wouldn't recommend it because again, it can lead to some severe gastric issues and you're not going to be running anywhere if you're cramping. So,
Is that how it's taken, just to store it, just a spoonful?
Yeah.
Out of
Yeah, that's the way they do it. That's the way they do it in these studies.
Before your interval session. Okay.
Yeah. Again, try at your own risk. Maybe try a small, if you're really interested, maybe try a tiny bit first. But again, I wouldn't recommend it. It is for higher intensity things, so yeah, like higher interval sessions. It's possibly more likely to have an effect than in a continual like marathon session or a long distance session. But again, very specific situations, and I don't know personally if it's worth the potential hassle. Beta-alanine, very much some of the same things. Multivitamins, this is more for a health perspective obviously, but multivitamins can help if you struggle getting vegetables in, but I would always say food first. Try and make sure you're having vegetables and fruit over multivitamins. That is only if very specific situations in which you know that you're deficient in something. Vitamin D, however, as we all know, is miserable now. So in the winter months, vitamin D I'd absolutely recommend because it's the sunshine vitamin, so we're not going to be getting any from now on for a short while. Omega-3, again, same with the multivitamins. I would suggest making sure that you consume all of your oily fish because there are various different types of omega-3s. And so we don't know what's the optimal dose and different ratio of the different fats. And so basically, if you make sure that you're consuming enough oily fish, you're likely to make sure that you're having enough. And iron, again, very specific, so typically more for female athletes, purely because more likely to be anemic than men. So iron supplementation can help there. But I would, again, I'd counsel trying to get it through food if you can. A lot of people don't like liver, but liver is a really good option if you can take it, if you can stand it. Some stuff here for supplements that need future research. Beetroot juice, massive at the moment. Antioxidants, again, same as beetroot juice. Probiotics, that's from a health perspective. No proof of a benefit. Glucosamine, medium-chain triglycerides, coenzyme A and ZMA. It's kind of one of those where somebody suggested it and then sports nutrition societies have gone mad, but there's actually not enough evidence to suggest that they're going to work. Banned or at high risk of contamination. Glycerol, ginseng. This is a steroid, obviously. I just throw one in there just for the crack. There are many others. There are thousands of banned substances. I don't know what level everybody runs at here, but if there's even the smallest chance that you might get drugs tested, I would avoid anything that might be contaminated. And the risk is, there is quite a high rate of contamination. So in 634 products tested, 15% pro-hormone not declared on the label in one study, and then in another study, 114 tested, 10% were contaminated. It might not seem like high numbers there, but if you're running the risk of 15%, you're going to start taking something that's, I don't know, going to do terrible things to you and you're going to be banned. I don't think it would be particularly worth it, especially considering the fact that we know that food is probably going to be better for you in the long run, and the supplements may not even have the desired effect that they're going to have. And if they do have the desired effect, it might be that 15% that are contaminated, so it might not be worth it. I realise that's quite an extreme statement to say. If you're really interested in taking supplements, I'd always counsel going for the batch tested. So I think Premium Nutrition have one called like Gold Standard or something like that. Some companies do have a batch testing process. They are much more expensive, but it's helping ensure that you're not taking anything that's not stated in there, and so that's something worth considering. So I think that's everything I have in terms of the slides. So we can have a quick drink break or food break if everybody likes. I'll leave this up here. So these are some of the accounts that I recommend people follow. So Nutricate and Be More Nutrition. These are more, Nutricate is more from a health and sports site. So I actually know Kate personally, we did our master together. She does a lot of stuff with like meal planning and stuff like that. Be More Nutrition, Richie, he does a lot of making papers more accessible, so putting everything in a non-scientific way, and I think he does it a lot better than I do, so you'll be interested in seeing him. And he's also started a podcast where he's interviewing a lot of people in nutrition, so that's quite exciting. This was the one that I mentioned earlier, Yang Lemieux Sports Science, where he makes infographics about all of these different papers that are interesting. The Nutritional Advocate, Alan, he, again, similar to Richie, basically puts a lot of stories and a lot of information up about contemporary nutrition issues, so things that are going on in the media. He will break down all of the research in a really succinct way, so that's good. And then Jorn Trammell and Asker Eukenrud, both eminent scientists in their field, so Jorn does lots of protein stuff, and Asker Eukenrud, one of the godfathers of sports nutrition, massive with carbohydrates. So if you're on Instagram, these are really worth following. It's really interesting stuff that they put out there. So yeah, we can have a quick, thanks very much. We can have a quick break if you like, and then I'm happy to discuss. And if anyone's got any more burning questions, and I'm here for probably about an hour if people want to have a chat. Yeah.